Hello, I'm Dr. Leonard Matheson. I'm a neurorehabilitation psychologist working at Epic Rehab in St. Louis, Missouri. This is a reprise on a video basis of a teleconference that we did on February 2, 2011, as part of our monthly Clinical Research Consortium meetings. The focus of today's talk is on methods to evaluate vocationally relevant executive dysfunction. I'm going to present this in two parts. The first giving some of the conceptual background and how it applies to early evaluation tasks, and the second getting more into the performance evaluation tasks. Before we begin, though, I want to establish a good foundation that's really important for all of us to recognize. Let's begin with the definitions. Executive function is the ability to integrate various component cognitive abilities to produce meaningful task performance. Executive dysfunction is the relative inability to devise novel responses, suppress habitual responses, identify and correct errors, and plan, organize, and initiate new solutions to challenging tasks. I want to present these because we're looking both at executive function and dysfunction, and the focus is on meaningful task performance in response to challenging tasks. As such, executive function is highly ecological. Executive function is an ecological phenomenon that optimally differentiates individuals in terms of their potential for competitive success. And this is the reason that we need to evaluate executive function as we consider work capacity and the person's potential for employment. Now, it's very important for us to recognize that neuropsychological testing is not ecological. Let's start with this quote. Certain of the implicit approaches adopted in the design of neuropsychological tests makes the patient's impairment less likely to manifest themselves in the test situation. The patient typically has a single explicit problem to tackle at any one time. The trials tend to be very short. Task initiation is strongly prompted by the examiner, and what constitutes successful trial completion is clearly characterized. Rarely are patients required to organize or plan their behavior over longer time periods, or to set priorities in the face of two or more competing tasks. Yet it is these sorts of executive abilities which are a large component of many everyday activities. That quote is from Chalice and Burgess, Deficits in Strategy Application Following Frontal Lobe Brain Damage in Man, presented in the journal Brain in 1991. Let me provide you with another pertinent and important quote. When executive functions are impaired, the individual may no longer be capable of satisfactory self-care, of performing remunerative or useful work independently, or of maintaining normal social relationships regardless of how well preserved the cognitive capacities are, or how high the person scores on tests of skills, knowledge, and abilities. A major obstacle to examining the executive functions is the paradoxical need to structure a situation in which patients can show whether and how well they can make structure for themselves. This is Lezak, Howison, and Loring, Neuropsychological Assessment 2004. Now, I present these to you because they are crucial for you to understand that neuropsychological test results are not only not ecological, but don't serve the needs that we have to take a look at executive dysfunction. Notwithstanding the fact that neuropsychologists will insist that they do evaluate executive dysfunction, the methods that they use are extremely limited and don't get at the ecology of the person in the environment, especially the ecology of the person in the work environment. And so for those of us who look at executive dysfunction using simulations of work samples, and community performance measures, we really do have senior data. Our data are much more important to the evaluation of the person's ability to work than are the data collected by the neuropsychologist. These references from highly regarded neuropsychologists set the stage for a discussion of our interdisciplinary territories. The interdisciplinary approach is crucial in neurorehabilitation because the span of responsibilities is too great for any single profession. As the patient becomes a client and makes progress through rehabilitation, participants on the team and the leadership of the team adjusts to meet his or her ecological demands. We can get a better handle on this by taking a look at the stage model of neurorehabilitation presented in a paper a few years ago by myself and Tim Wolfe and Matt Dodson in the Work Special Interest section quarterly. In this model, we begin at stage 1 looking at pathology and diagnosis and progress as the patient progresses from being a patient to being a client up through the stages to stage 8, where earning capacity is addressed. Now, one way to look at this is that this is work rehabilitation's ecological span, the environment within which we work professionally to address the range of issues presented here. I'd like to point out that the occupational therapist, as indicated by OT, beginning at stage 2 and working up through stage 7, is a predominant professional in this model. The focus of occupational therapy services begins working on a team with the neurologist and neuropsychologist and physical therapist and speech and language pathologist at level 2, looking at impairment. The occupational therapist moves into a leadership role in stage 3, functional limitation, stage 4, occupational disability, and stage 5 when we look at vocational feasibility. At stage 6, the occupational therapist continues on the team, supporting the rehabilitation counselor and vocational evaluator, and that continues at stage 7, looking at vocational handicap. A question I'd like to pose to you now is, why do we need to have our methods vocationally relevant? That's the argument I'd like to make, but let me ask, why should we not just consider occupational executive dysfunction broadly? For example, looking at instrumental activities of daily living, with the kitchen task assessment that has been the basis of the executive function performance test developed by Carolyn Baum and Dorothy Edwards and their colleagues. Or why not just take a look at community tasks in terms of the multiple errands test developed by Shallis and Burgess and many others now in North America? The reason is that vocational executive dysfunction has special characteristics. It's not that the EFPT or the multiple errands test are lacking, it's really that they're just a bit off focus. Vocational executive function has special characteristics that those tests don't do a very good job of addressing. So let's take a look at some of the vocational characteristics that are important to consider as we evaluate people in terms of their executive dysfunction. Important vocational characteristics include the range of difficulty of the job tasks, beginning with the level of complexity, but also including the range of complexity faced by the person from very simple to quite complex. Another area has to do with competing cognitive resource demands. This is a huge difference between what we do and what neuropsychologists do as we take a look at vocational characteristics and the person's abilities to meet those job demands. And the range of judgment and creativity necessary to do problem solving in many jobs is really quite astounding. And then we have time pressure and urgency as a set of vocational characteristics that's found in every competitive employment setting. And last but not least, we need to take a look at the error consequences and the mission criticality of the task. This is often what stops people from being able to maintain employment even after they've returned to their usual and customary employment or found a new job. Making a critical error that crippled the ability of the company to carry out its mission has lost many of our clients' jobs. And finally, in the competitive employment environment, there is always competitive pressure. The competitive pressure comes from younger workers, newer workers, better trained workers, people with whom our client competes for a paycheck. The competitive pressure is really felt by our clients, and due to brain injury itself and also self-confidence that's been eroded by the disability experience, our clients are quite often less capable of handling competitive pressure. Now, let's keep these characteristics in mind as we consider evaluating a client's executive function. Let's compare how they would do cooking a simple dish in a home kitchen with working as a cook in a modern restaurant. In the first case, there really wouldn't be much multitasking or rapid serial switching. In the latter case, there'd be a tremendous amount. Although there might be a few interruptions in a home kitchen, there would not be numerous and continuous interruptions like you would find in a modern restaurant. Similarly, there's not likely to be much time-pressured performance in a home kitchen like you would find in a modern restaurant. And you'd have very forgiving quality control in a home kitchen compared with the very high level of quality control in a modern restaurant provided by bosses and customers. And then finally, You have no competitive remuneration in a home kitchen. And of course, competitive remuneration is based on performance in a modern restaurant. So, to the degree that task demands require judgment and creativity with complexity and time urgency in a competitive environment, executive functions are increasingly important. And this is the set of characteristics that we need to keep in mind as we evaluate our client's ability to return to the competitive employment environment. We must respect the competitive work environment. The client respects and sometimes fears the competitive work environment. We've got to be able to evaluate our client's ability to handle the rigors of that type of employment. So with this in mind, let's return to the ecological span of work rehabilitation and take a look at where occupational therapists provide leadership. Occupational therapists provide team leadership as the team evaluates the client's functional limitations. That's where the clinic and community performance tests, like the EFPT and the MET, are quite pertinent. At the next level up, the occupational therapist leads the team in evaluating occupational disability. That's where we find work simulations and work samples of most use. And at the next level up, where we look at vocational feasibility, it's the occupational therapist and the vocational evaluator working together. They use situational assessments, sometimes in a clinic, sometimes in an office environment, sometimes in an industrial environment, to evaluate executive function and dysfunction. What occupational therapists are doing as they provide leadership to the team across stage 3, 4, and 5 is setting the stage for looking at employability, vocational handicap, and ultimately earning capacity of the worker. Let's take a look at 3 executive dysfunction measures in a real case study. In today's talk, I'm only going to be focused on self-report and informant report using the behavior rating inventory of executive function. In the next talk, we'll get into performance and observation, collecting information with the behavioral assessment of vocational skills, the BAVs, and also the PODS segment, the doll chair assembly task. My client is a 28-year-old female who works in a telephone retail store at a mall. She was injured about 4 years ago. She had been a fairly successful manager of the small retail store in which she worked at the mall. She returned to that same store at a lower level, actually working in the back as she worked her way up to counter work, and she comes to me now about 2 years after returning to work, still working at the counter and not yet being able to return to work as a manager. She's also only able to work part-time because of a problem with fatigue. She works 4 6-hour shifts each week. Each of the brief versions were administered to the client and boyfriend and mother on an independent blind basis. So let's take a look at what we've got here. First of all, the brief scores are standardized in terms of a T-score that has a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10. The red bar is at a T-score of 65. Scores of 65 or above generally indicate an area of concern. There are 2 groups of executive function constructs that the brief looks at. The first group has to do with behavioral regulation, looking at the client's ability to inhibit their responses, shift from one task to another, their emotional control, and their ability to self-monitor. The next group considers metacognitive abilities. The metacognition index is a compilation of scores that reflects the person's ability to initiate tasks, their working memory, their ability to plan and organize, their task monitoring, and their ability to maintain organization of materials. The final score is the Global Executive Composite, which is a compilation of the 9 clinical constructs that we've already looked at. And we find that the mother's score is extremely high, above the 70th T-score. The client and her boyfriend are elevated, but only up to about the 60th T-score. Now, this gross comparison is a good place to start. As we begin to develop hypotheses about the information we're collecting and how this would point us to performance tests that we're going to administer in a little bit, this gross comparison may provide us with indicators of sensitivity or bias as we compare each rater's observation of the client's behavior in the month prior to administration. We can also take a look at the comparison between the metacognitive index scores of the mother compared with the client and boyfriend. And we find a pretty significant difference, about 15 T-scores. We also see a difference of about 15 T-scores between the mother and the boyfriend and the client in terms of the behavioral regulation index as well. But let me pause here and ask you to just take a look at the two groups of scores. On the left, we've got the behavioral regulation scores. On the right, we've got the metacognitive scores. In which area is this client having more difficulty? It's behavioral regulation. In which area is there the most discrepancy between the client and boyfriend and the mother? Well, generally, it's in the metacognitive area, although we do have that huge difference between the client and boyfriend or mother in terms of self-monitoring in the behavioral regulation area. We'll talk about that in a moment. We also see a huge elevation of the mother's score in terms of her perception of her daughter's ability to shift from one task to another, up at about the 85th T-score. Now, what is it that makes up the shift score? Let me read some of the items to you. I have trouble changing from one activity or task to another. I have trouble accepting different ways to solve problems with work, friends, or tasks. I have trouble thinking of a different way to solve a problem when I'm stuck. I get disturbed by unexpected changes in my daily routine. Now, client and boyfriend indicate that my client has some problems with this that exceed the median, but mother is really concerned about it. The difference is really important to pay attention to, and what we need to do is to have a conversation with the mother to get some examples of things that she's seen so that we can figure out how to evaluate that in terms of performance later in the evaluation. Now let's take a look at this huge difference between the client's appraisal of her self-monitoring and the rating offered by her boyfriend and her mother. What is self-monitoring? The items in self-monitoring include: I don't notice when I cause others to feel bad or get mad until it is too late. I talk at the wrong time. I say things without thinking. I don't think about consequences before doing something. So those are the kind of issues that we would explore independently with the client and her mother. We try to get a handle on examples of when that's happened to see if we can pick up a pattern. For instance, does this never occur in the morning after a good night's sleep and always occur in the afternoon and evening when she's fatigued? That would be a reasonable expectation for a person who's had a brain injury, but we need to check that out. We start by actually asking questions about the timing and pattern of these particular behaviors. Next, we want to take a look at a possible resource that the client has. Scores that are within the normal range in terms of her appraisal of herself and her boyfriend's appraisal of her behavior, but elevated for the mother in terms of her appraisal of her daughter's behavior. Now, within the metacognitive index, we find two really interesting patterns. The first one has to do with elevations with regard to initiation and working memory. With regard to initiation, all three provide a modest elevation. With regard to working memory, both the client and her mother indicate that there's a significant problem. The boyfriend either doesn't notice it or doesn't consider it a problem. Now, from our perspective, of course, working memory is a crucial executive function that's going to affect the person's ability to be competitively employed. So we want to take a close look at this to see whether or not it's a problem with the boyfriend's insensitivity to a potential problem with working memory, or he actually sees things differently than mother and client do. The next area that we need to take a close look at is the mother's appraisal of her daughter's behavior and the daughter's self-appraisal in terms of task monitoring. The mother's appraisal has resulted in a very serious elevation above the 70th T-score, while the client is down at about the 55th T-score and the boyfriend is down at the 45th T-score. And then finally, let's take a look at a possible resource that the client has. Both she and her boyfriend have indicated that she has fewer problems with organizing materials than other people her age. Even her mother recognizes that her daughter's near the normal range in terms of her abilities to organize materials. This may be the reason that she's able to maintain employment in spite of all of the other problems with executive function that she appears to have. Another potential resource has to do with planning and organizing, which my client and her boyfriend both rate right at the median level, and the mother is only about one standard deviation above the median. We're going to investigate this further because this also might be one of the reasons that she's able to maintain employment. We'd like to emphasize her development in that area. And so, given the information provided by the brief, what sorts of executive function targets can we identify? Well, there are some that have to do with her potential weaknesses in terms of behavioral regulation, having to do with her ability to shift and self-monitor. We've also got some potential problems in terms of metacognitive coordination, having to do with her ability to initiate tasks, her working memory, and her task monitoring. But we've also got some potential strengths that we've identified that we need to take a closer look at. We have two strengths that have to do with metacognitive coordination: her ability to plan and organize tasks, and her ability to maintain organization of materials. This use of self-report and informant report data sets the stage for us to do a very nice performance evaluation. And that's going to be the focus of our next talk. We're going to evaluate the client's performance and we're going to observe her behavior. We're going to administer the behavioral assessment of vocational skills, the BAVS or the wheelbarrow task. We're also going to take a look at one of the tests from the progressive occupational demand system that I've developed, the doll chair assembly task. Before we leave, I'd like to point you to a resource that you're going to find useful. My friend and colleague Tanya Percy presents a workshop on cognitive FCE that's sponsored by Matheson Education and Training Solutions. You can find information about them on the web. So thank you for participating in this clinical research consortium. You can follow us at mathesondevelopment.com. I'm Len Matheson, signing off. Take care now.